Hey, John chapter 10 is a busy chapter. It's full of shepherds and sheep and pens and confusing language that drive people in polar opposite directions. And so it begins with, in my version, the NASB, the one I use, verse 6 says, "This figure of speech Jesus used." Well, if you compare English translations, the Greek behind that figure of speech language in my version is also translated as this illustration that Jesus used, or this parable that he used, or this proverb, or this allegory, or analogy, or indirect manner of speaking, or simple story. Lots of different ways people have translated what it is that Jesus is sharing here. It's not a typical parable like we would see in the Synoptic Gospels, because it has to do with Jesus himself. Usually a parable that Jesus would say is, there was a man and he did this thing. But here we have Jesus sharing a figure of speech. I've heard it most often referred to outside of the translations as a metaphor that Jesus is sharing. But before we get into those metaphors, we've got a little bit of work to do. This chapter division is an unfortunate one, chapter 10, because if you were just reading chapter 10, you might assume that these metaphors or parables or whatever they are just standalone things. But in our lesson, we kind of went back and found out who these were being spoken to. It's a large group of people, but largely the religious leadership of the day. We also know that this is tied back to chapter 9 because of a statement way down here in chapter 10, verse 21. At the end of this section, it says, "Others were saying, 'These are not the sayings of one demon possessed. A demon cannot open the eyes of the blind, can he?'" What does that tie us back to, that statement? The events of chapter 9, the healing of the blind man. So we know that this whole conversation in the first half, and really the whole chapter, because it's on topic, even though it's not at the exact same time, the whole conversation in chapter 10 is tied directly to the events of chapter 9 and the healing that happens there. Let's go back, though, and lay a little bit of groundwork, because we're going to be talking about the temple. That's where a lot of the consternation happens here in Jerusalem. That's where Jesus goes. If we go all the way back to the beginning of the story, the biblical story, we find ourselves in Genesis at the creation, and man and woman are placed within a garden east of Eden. And this garden, I'm going to suggest to you, as it's been suggested to me by several commentators and journal articles, that this Garden of Eden was sacred space. This is a space, God took Adam and Eve, placed them in this sacred space. And it's sacred because of the relationship that the Adam and Eve, humanity, had with God in that location. And then what happens? Sin happens. A decision not to follow God's way, but go a different way. And that's caused a break in the relationship. It caused the sacred space to still remain, but what happened with Adam and Eve? They were removed from the sacred space, so their relationship with God wasn't the same. So if we fast forward to Moses now, see how fast we're going? If we fast forward to Moses at Mount Sinai is given directions on a tabernacle to build. And it's this tabernacle that has features that are to remind people of the original context of the Garden of Eden. The lampstand, for instance, has fruit on it, and it looks like a tree. Was there a tree in the garden? Well, yeah, that seems to be. There were two trees, right? There was decorations throughout the tabernacle. The way it was described that suggests that it was a reminder of a situation that no longer existed, that man was not in that sacred space anymore, but it was a physical picture to remind people that there is a sacred space. Don't forget it. Even though you find yourself in the world and you're working under your own power, because that's the curse of Adam and Eve, removal from that sacred space, God said, I'm going to solve this problem, and in the meantime, I want you to set up this physical reminder of sacred space, a way that you can approach me and be in relationship with me. It's supposed to be a reflection of who God is and his character and his nature and how he functions, right? The problem is what? Well, similar to Adam and Eve, what happens when man gets in charge of not the sacred space, but the symbol of the sacred space? Well, it doesn't always function correctly, right? So as we come to the Gospels, the world that Jesus comes to is a world where that tabernacle that was a mobile structure changed to a more permanent location, the temple, has all the same furniture in it. It has the same ministry that the tabernacle had. But is it functioning correctly? Nah, it's not even close. In fact, when people look at, the goal is you're supposed to be able to look at the temple, whether you be an Israelite or one passing through the nation from a neighboring country. You're to look at this and you're to get an idea of who God is, the revelation of the unseen world. And what was happening was the ministry of the temple had degraded so far that people were looking at this and getting a completely incorrect picture of who God was and how he operated. The rules that were being sold around this ministry weren't reflective of God's mercy and grace. Does that make sense? So, as we go into the Gospels, really, Jesus' ministry was multi-layered. I'll acknowledge that, but I see it, as public ministry especially, as kind of being twofold. One aspect of his public ministry is to identify that this temple that's currently in existence in his day is just not right. Its ministry is not right. The people in charge are not right. It's not a correct representation of sacred space with God. He's going to identify that. That's part of his public ministry. The other part of his public ministry is, despite this being totally off, this ministry of the temple, there's still people reading the Old Testament revelation and coming to faith in God. True faith, despite the temple just being upside down and backwards. And so the second part of Jesus' public ministry is not just identifying the bad and exposing it, but also identifying those people, the remnant of faithful believers in and around the physical nation of Israel, and calling them to himself, right? And what I will argue tonight is actually calling them out, driving them out of the temple ministry. And we'll talk about that as it goes. Examples of this, clear in the last two chapters. So chapter 8 and 9. Quick recap, what happened in 8? Well, it started with the Pharisees bringing a woman caught in adultery, right? Trying to trap him. Jesus does what? Half of his public ministry exposes the leadership for who they are, right? And they all drop their rocks because they've been exposed for who they are. Sends her on her way with an offer of forgiveness, and then declares that he's the light of the world. Has an ongoing discussion for the rest of chapter 8 with the leadership. He says things like this: I came from my Father. He is the one that bears witness to who I am, but you don't accept his witness. In fact, it's because you're not of my Father. What's he doing? He's exposing the temple leadership for who it is, for what it is. And it's interesting, if you remember in chapter 8, about halfway through, there's 3 little verses that said, as he was having this discussion, exposing this, what happened? Many people in the crowd believed in him. Well, who's coming to faith in Jesus while he's having this exposed dialogue about the temple and its leadership? It's likely, I would posit, the remnant who already has an existing faith in God the Father through the Old Testament revelation of who he is and how he functions, hearing Jesus talk about what God is like and saying, that's the God in which I believe, right? And they come to him because he's only saying the things the Father told him to say. He's a correct reflection as opposed to the temple, which is currently a very incorrect reflection. So that's chapter 8. At the very end of chapter 8, the last part of chapter 8, the last verse says that Jesus left the temple. And it might be just a throwaway verse as we commonly read through it, but I think that's calculated, that it specifically says Jesus left the temple. And I'll tell you why. Because as we get into chapter 9, this is last week, with the blind man, as he's leaving the temple, what does he find? He finds a man. And we don't know it yet as readers, but this man is a man of great faith. How do I know? Well, just go on down to the end. I mean, do you know who the Son of Man is? Well, tell me who he is so that I may believe in him. It's me. And what's the response? He bows and worships, right? So we know at the end, this man is a man of great faith. He's receptive. He's ready to accept this Son of Man character coming out of Daniel 7. And Jesus picks him out of the crowd. And what does he tell him to do? First of all, Jesus works, and that's important because it's a Sabbath. And then he puts the mud on his eyes and said, now you go do work and get a lot of attention doing it at the public pool, right? And Jesus knows what? He's going to go down there, do work. Everybody's going to be all chitter-chatter, right? It's going to be on Facebook. It's all over Twitter. It's incredible. Which is going to bring in the religious police, which is part of his public ministry to expose. It's going to cause a conversation to happen, which will end up with this guy concluding, I don't know who you say he is, but I can see, and I didn't used to be able to see, so I think he's a prophet of God. And what's the result? He's kicked out. And it's this word kicked out, or put out, in the translation that I was using. That is an interesting Greek word. It's used often, a lot, in the Synoptic Gospels, mostly to describe the driving out of demons, right? In the saving of demon-possessed people. We don't have any of those in John, and it's only used 6 times in John. First time, back in chapter 2, what happened in chapter 2? Jesus got a whip, and he drove out the money changer. So we're at the temple, and he's clearing up the picture of what should be happening at the temple and that it's not right, okay? Ekbalo, the Greek word for drive out, okay? But then we get to chapter 9, and we read that this blind man's parents were a little hesitant to say who they thought Jesus was. Why? For fear, because the corrupt leadership had made a rule that said if you confess Jesus as who he says he is, that you will be put out of the synagogue. Ekbalo, put out, driven out, okay? And later we see that the blind man does confess who Jesus is, and he is put out. And what's the very next statement? When Jesus heard that he had been put out, he found him. And he gave further revelation as to who he was, and that's when the worship started, right? Chapter 9 is a physical example of the parables in chapter 10. When Jesus tells the story in chapter 10 of the 2 sheepfolds, he's describing the events that are happening then and there. Let me explain. Chapter 10, verse 1. We're finally to chapter 10. This is good. We're making some progress. But we started in Genesis, so this is really good. Truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter by the door into the fold of the sheep, but climbs up some other way, he's a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is a shepherd of the sheep. Okay, so there's 2 different type of sheepfolds that Jesus is talking about in this first half of this chapter. The first one is a sheepfold that's found close to town. Shepherds would often take their flocks far away from the place that they lived, and they would end up at other villages. They'd be short on supplies, And every village back then had a sheepfold close or inside of town where these visiting shepherds could place their flock, go into town, catch up on supplies, come back out, and retract their flock back out. In the sheepfold, there were often more than one flock. You get multiple shepherds bringing their flocks in. There's a doorkeeper, right, who checks the sheep in, knows who the shepherd is. That shepherd goes into town, comes back out, and that doorkeeper recognizes, oh, you're a shepherd of one of the flocks in here. I'll open my doors. You can call your sheep out. And so the shepherd goes in, calls his sheep out, and sheep have been characterized as stupid, but they're smart enough to recognize their shepherd's voice. And there have been actually some cases that I've heard about. I have no experience, but some shepherds actually have named their sheep and can call their sheep by name, and they recognize their name, not just the voice. This is what's happening in this first sheepfold. This is what Jesus is describing in this metaphor that he gives us. I come to the door. I'm recognized as the shepherd of the fold that's inside. The door is open to me. I go in and I call my own. Now, is he calling all the sheep out of this fold? No. And I would suggest to you, based on the background that we just went through, I would suggest to you that in this example, there are two folds of sheep in this pen. And who are those? One is true believers that have read the Old Testament and have come to a saving faith in that revelation, expecting a Messiah to show up. The other is non-believers. And Jesus is coming to the fold. What's the fold? Well, it might be physical Israel, but I think it's more than that. I think it's the ministry of the temple. I think he's coming to the ministry of the temple in Judaism, and he is identifying his sheep, and he's calling them out. And those that are his, meaning those that already have an existing faith with God the Father, are recognizing his voice as the shepherd. Who's the shepherd in the Old Testament? Ezekiel passage. It's very God himself. Jesus comes saying the words of God because he is God. They recognize it and they follow him. He leads them out of the fold, which is really interesting because in verse 4, when he puts forth all his own, he goes ahead of them. Puts forth. I'm going to let you guess what Greek word that is. Ekbalo. When he drives, it's not put forth. It's a good translation, but it's not exactly it's not consistently translated. It's when he drives out his own. Jesus is driving out his flock out of the sheep pen. What's the sheep pen? The ministry of the temple. It's Jesus that's driving them out. But if you go back into chapter 9, who does it say puts them out? It's the religious leadership. So you read through chapter 9, and you might get the impression that it's the religious leadership that are putting these people out of access to the ministry. But you get to chapter 10, and Jesus is telling the true story, and what's Jesus say? It's not you that are putting them out. I'm the one that told them to go wash in the pool of Siloam. I knew that would lead to a conversation. I knew that would lead to him recognizing who I am because I healed him. And I knew that would lead to you putting him out. So who really put him out? Me. That's my ministry. Exposing this and calling the true believers to not be a part of that anymore. It would have been a very confusing time. Now think about this. You're an Old Testament believer. You've read the scriptures. You've come to a saving faith. And it's those scriptures that tell you to go where to worship God. To the temple, to the synagogue. But when you get there, what do you find? Nothing that looks like the God in which you believe. It's very confusing because you want to go there because you've been told to go there, but when you go there, you don't get the feeling that the people there believe the same thing you do. Does that make sense? So while they're recognizing Jesus and following him, they're also conflicted. And you see this with the parents in the previous chapter. They know who Jesus is. They knew their son was blind. But why are they not saying? Because of fear of not having access to the place that God told them to go. So Jesus' ministry to this conflicted group of believers is follow me and don't worry about that. That is passing away. In fact, he says in John 4, the day will come, and in fact is now, when the mountain you worship on isn't going to be a factor. It already isn't a factor. But worshiping in spirit and in truth, that's what's important. That's the ministry of Jesus. That's the correct version, the correct display of how God works. So that's the first sheepfold. How are we doing on time? Oh, not bad. All right. That's the first sheepfold. And then we get to verse 7. Notice that, verse 6, this Jesus told them, but they did not understand. Which means what? Because the parable he just told them is describing this exact situation that he's living. So he's coming to the fold, which is the religious leadership of the day, and he's calling his sheep out, and some are not hearing his voice because they're not of his flock. And so he just tells this parable, and then it says, but these people did not understand what he was saying. They heard his voice, but they didn't recognize it, in other words, right? Yeah, that's interesting. So Jesus again said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. Now we've gotten to a different type of sheepfold. We're not in close to town anymore, where there's a doorkeeper and multiple flocks. Now we've gone out to pasture. We're away from the city, and periodically what you would find in Israel is sheep pens that were constructed usually of, can you guess? Rocks, good, because that's what they have a lot of in Israel. And the shepherds collectively would build a wall in a circle, leaving just a little doorway open. There was no door in it. It was just an opening, but it was completely surrounded by rocks. It was a place that when they were away from the city, at nighttime they could have their entire flock go inside, and then the shepherd would actually sit in the doorway, kind of sideways, physically becoming a barrier to the sheep getting out, and thus protecting them at nighttime from the wolves and anything that would want to kill them. This is the second sheepfold that Jesus is talking about. I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. Is it the same sheepfold that he was talking about at first, which we've kind of concluded was Judaism and the religious? No, it's not that one. He's driven the true believers out of that, and he's taken them where? Out to pasture, somewhere else, away from the city. And he's identified them as his flock, and he is now becoming the entrance, the doorway to safety. The doorway to safety for his flock. He invites them into the sheepfold at night. He becomes the door. Nobody gets through it into the fold except through him as the door. That makes sense in the imagery, right? So, you still get the opportunity for thieves and robbers that speak into the situation. And in verse 9 it says, I am the door. If anyone enters through me, he will be saved. It's his ministry. It's the replacement ministry of the temple that's no longer working or functioning correctly. It's now he becomes the door through which safety and salvation is found. They will go in and out and find pasture, and I will be their shepherd, right? That imagery. The thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. But his purpose is that the flock has life the way it was meant to be, in undisturbed, sacred relationship with very God himself. A picture of what Adam and Eve originally had in the garden, and a foretaste of a perfect world in the yet future in which there will be no sin and no hindrance in that relationship. Talks about hired hands. Who's he talking about when he talks about hired hands? People that don't really care about the sheep, that disappear the first time that any adverse effects come their way. Who's he talking? He's exposing the people he's talking to. Remember who he's given this parable to. The Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. Now listen to this. I lay down my life for the sheep. Later, in verse 18, it will say, I lay down my life so that I may take it again. No one has taken it away from me. I lay it down on my own initiative. What's significant about that? If you listen to the rendition that the religious leadership was telling, you might get the impression that they are in charge and that they are kicking people out of the ministry, not being able to worship in synagogues or at the temple, and you might also get the impression that they are the ones that seized Jesus and killed him. But what is Jesus countering in this teaching on both of those points? It's not you that's kicking them out. You're ruling over dysfunction anyway. I'm the one driving them out. It's not you that's going to seize me and kill me. I am laying down my life. I am in total control, and because I lay it down, I am also able to pick it back up. That's an interesting distinction. Then he also has this verse 16, I have other sheep which are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will hear my voice. Reminds me of John chapter 4, when Jesus traveled to a distant land, although it was kind of close. It was theologically very distant in Samaria, and had a discussion with a Samaritan woman who quickly identified that she was talking to a prophet. And then when Jesus said, I'm the Messiah, she bought wholeheartedly into it without question. Who are we talking to? We're talking to a remnant believer that hears Jesus, but she's of another flock. And Jesus' ministry, and we see this in the book of Acts, Jesus' ministry is taking these two flocks, one that came out of Judaism and the ministry there, but true believers, and true believers that have been created elsewhere outside that flock, and marrying them together. Does that sound like the book of Acts and the rest of the New Testament? It's exactly what's happening. So, Jesus asserts his deity. Let me scroll down on my notes to make sure I don't miss anything here. Good. So, a division occurred. If we skip down to 10:19, it says, right after no one's taken it away from me, the next verse is, a division occurred again amongst the Jews because of these words. A division occurred. What does that sound like? Jesus understands when he talks, when he exposes the temple and its ministry for what it is, and he drives the true believers to himself, he understands there's going to be a division between these two flocks that are in this pen, one of believers and one of non-believers. And his words and his actions are going to cause a divide that push people to polar opposites. Does that make sense? And we see it right here. We're at the end of the teaching, and it said a division occurred. Well, this is not surprising. This is exactly what he's trying to do, right? Many of them were saying, he's demon-possessed. They're not believing in him. Others were saying, I don't think somebody can heal a blind person and be demon-possessed, so we're coming to a different conclusion. He's dividing and drawing and getting people kicked out. At that time, the Feast of Dedication. So we're in the second half, and we'll kind of quickly go through this because it's a conversation. It's later. We're now in December. We're at a different, at Hanukkah, as we have come to understand it. And he's back at the temple. What's he going to do when he's at the temple? He's going to expose the temple ministry for what it is, right, and the leadership. So that's what he does. If you're the Christ, tell us plainly. And he said, I did. I mean, what have I not said? and yet you don't believe. And then he starts talking about his sheep. And remember the first sheepfold, the ones that hear his voice and come to him, the true remnant believers? My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. And remember, John's writing about 30 or so odd years later. Okay? He's writing about events that happened during Jesus' ministry, but he's also writing right before the temple gets destroyed. The temple's still operating at the time he's writing this, but we know that the temple's going to be gone within a generation, and it's already been 30 years. So it's right around the corner. And what John is doing here is he's bringing Jesus' words out that says, in this transition, the true believers that got kicked out of the temple, they're not lost, as people might think, because the temple leadership is making you think that they're doing all this. But this is a secure transaction. They were in the Father's hands. They've been passed off to me. I've got them in my hands. I'm not going to let them go. No one's lost in this transition. This temple and everything they're saying, it's not functioning correctly. It's going by the wayside very shortly. And so Jesus has this conversation ongoing with the religious leadership. And he concludes with this: If I do not do the works of my Father, do not believe in me. But if I do them, though you do not believe me, believe the works, so that you may know and understand that the Father is in me and I in the Father. Fascinating to me, because a lot of people would like you to think that these people are not believers and there's no chance for them. And here Jesus, understanding that they're not currently believers, they're hypocrites, they're functioning in a dysfunctional ministry, what does he say? There's going to be a work, Jesus says, that if you're ever going to believe, I will do a work that can cause you, even you, to believe. What is that work? Those of you that know the Gospels. It's the sign of Jonah, right? This evil and perverse generation only gets one sign, and it's a big one. But it is big enough to even convince people caught in hypocrisy. There's a chance. It's not that their destiny has been written. You're in this camp and you're always that camp because God didn't choose you. It's you're here now and there's a chance for you, but I'm going to focus on the people coming and hearing my voice right now. Your sign's coming. The third day is coming. And thank God it did. Right? So therefore, they were seeking again to seize him. And he eluded their grasp. I love that. I like to think he's kind of wily that way. And he went away again beyond the Jordan to the place. Now, notice what's happening here in the story, what John's doing. He went away again beyond the Jordan to the place where John was first baptizing, and he was staying there. Many people came to him and were saying, while John performed no sign yet, everything John said about this man is true, and many believed in him there. Practically, what's going on in the narrative? Jesus, in the end of chapter 8, leaves the fold, the sheep pen, on his way out. He's calling his sheep. He's driving the blind man, the sheep, out of the pen. And where does he go? He went away again, out into pasture. And what's he doing there? He's becoming the door in the second sheep pen for those who believe in him there. Do you see that? Oh, John is a great writer. Well, let me say this. God's a great storyteller, isn't he? And the fact that he was able to work his story in and through John's gospel, the way that it's progressed, it's just fascinating. So, practically, if we read this in context, this is how I'll end. What does this mean? I mean, what's the practical takeaway? Because some people take this conversation in chapter 10, take it completely out of context, and then try and apply it and create theology about how God works outside of the context that it was given. I'm just going to suggest to you what we just went through, that process of identifying the original context, suggests that it's probably a characteristic of humanity in a fallen world that will take pictures of how God works in his ministry and corrupt it. Does that make sense? It's probably just it was a characteristic definitely of the time of Jesus, and that's what we see in context. But I think the takeaway is, this is probably a characteristic of humanity. In fact, if we go back through history, maybe we don't even have to go back through history. Maybe we just look at today and say, what has become of the institution of religion? And sometimes God is correctly reflected, and it leads people very cleanly into a correct understanding and perception of who he is. But sometimes the claims of being a picture of how God works are so distorted that I'd like to think that God is still calling his flock out of incorrect, dysfunctional religion that claims to be the true, but is so distorted, right? I go back to the Reformation, and if you know the story of Martin Luther, a guy who was caught in a system at that time that was very dysfunctional religiously, tried to work within that system, felt a call out of that system, and the Reformation of the 1500s was born. And then what happened? Well, that became corrupt. And the Puritans said that's not pure enough. And then what happened? Well, that got not quite right. And then, right? So I think the takeaway, the really practical application that we should be seeing out of chapter 10 and the story there surrounding is that let's try and get to a true understanding of who God is, what his mercy and grace looks like. And let's also kind of in the back of our minds expect that any given church may not live that out perfectly, right? So let's not be surprised by that. I don't think we are. But also, until we're called out of a situation, let's continue to follow what God has called us to do, to be ministers within the church, to be active participants, to be correcting agents and pictures of that mercy and grace that God has given us. And that is challenge enough, right? Amen to that. Let's pray. Dear God, thanks for the allusion, metaphor, whatever it is you shared. It was brilliant. And we see what you were doing. And we are so glad that you did it, not just for that generation of people and the important message that you were bringing to them, but also to tonight, to our year and our location. God, encourage us always to seek you out, to seek and understand what your mercy and grace looks like, and even if maybe we see imperfect implementations of that in the place where we worship. God, correct us. Draw us to yourself. Show us the truth. And give us the strength to live that out on a daily basis. In Jesus' name, amen.